I never thought my neighborhood in Coral Springs, Florida would become ground zero for a battle that would end with me being the only person standing between survival and complete chaos. But that's exactly what happened when Hurricane Ophelia decided to park itself over South Florida for 3 terrifying days. My name is Walter Owens, and I've been a licensed ham radio operator for 23 years. I got my technician license when I was 17, upgraded to general at 19, and finally earned my extra class license at 25. Ham radio isn't just a hobby for me. It's a passion that's connected me with people across the globe, helped me provide emergency communications during disasters, and given me a sense of purpose that few other activities could match. When I moved into the Sunset Meadows community 3 years ago, I knew the Homeowners Association had strict rules, but I figured I could work with them. The neighborhood was perfect otherwise. Close to my job as an IT systems administrator, good schools nearby for when I eventually had kids, and the houses were well maintained with that classic South Florida aesthetic. Palm trees lined the streets, the community pool was pristine, and most of my neighbors seemed friendly enough. I should have known better than to assume anything when it came to HOAs. The trouble started about 6 months after I moved in. I had been operating from inside my house with a modest indoor antenna, but the performance was terrible. Anyone who knows anything about ham radio understands that indoor antennas are compromises at best. I was struggling to make contacts beyond 100 miles, and forget about working any DX stations overseas. I needed a proper outdoor antenna, specifically a beam antenna for HF operations. I did my homework before submitting my application. I researched the FCC's PRB1 ruling, which was supposed to protect amateur radio operators from unreasonable HOA restrictions. I drafted a detailed proposal showing exactly where I wanted to mount my antenna, how it would be installed professionally, and even included information about how amateur radio operators provide critical emergency communications during disasters. I submitted everything to the Architectural Review Committee and waited. 3 weeks later, I got my response. Denied. The letter was short and to the point, signed by Francine Anderson, the president of the Sunset Meadows HOA board. According to her, the antenna would be an eyesore, could potentially decrease property values, and violated the community's aesthetic guidelines. She suggested I continue using my indoor antenna and wished me luck with my hobby. I tried the diplomatic approach first. I called Francine and asked if we could meet to discuss my proposal in more detail. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, and we met at the community clubhouse the following Tuesday evening. Francine was exactly what you'd picture when you think of an overzealous HOA president. She was in her early 50s, with that specific haircut that seemed to be standard issue for neighborhood busybodies, perfectly manicured nails, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant whenever she looked at anyone younger than 40. She brought 2 other board members with her, Patricia and Deanne, who nodded along with everything she said like bobblehead dolls. "Mr. Owens," Francine began, arranging papers in front of her on the table, "I appreciate your enthusiasm for your hobby, but you have to understand that we have standards to maintain in this community." "I do understand that," I replied, keeping my voice level. "That's why I've proposed mounting the antenna on the back of my roof, where it won't be visible from the street. Most of my neighbors wouldn't even know it was there." "Most isn't all," Francine countered. "Mrs. Henderson, who lives behind you, would certainly see it." And frankly, the idea of having some sort of radio tower in our neighborhood is simply unacceptable. "It's not a tower," I explained. "It's a beam antenna on a small mast, and I'm legally protected under FCC regulations. The PRB 1 ruling specifically states that HOAs must reasonably accommodate amateur radio antennas. Francine's expression hardened. Mr. Owens, I'm well aware of whatever regulations you're referring to. However, our covenants, conditions, and restrictions supersede your hobbies. The answer is no, and that's final. With respect, that's not how federal regulations work, I said. PRB 1 means you need to accommodate me unless there's a legitimate reason beyond aesthetics. The legitimate reason is that we don't want it, Francine said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. This meeting is over. I left that meeting frustrated but not defeated. I spent the next few days researching my options and discovered that, while PRB 1 was real, enforcing it was another matter entirely. I could file a complaint with the FCC, but they rarely got involved in individual disputes. I could sue the HOA, but that would cost thousands of dollars and take months or even years to resolve. Meanwhile, I continued operating with my terrible indoor antenna, growing more frustrated by the day. Every time I missed a contact because my signal was too weak, or when I heard about emergency nets forming during storms in other parts of the country, my annoyance with Francine and her board grew. Then, I made a decision that I knew would cause problems. I installed the antenna anyway. I waited until a weekend when Francine was out of town. I saw her posting pictures on the neighborhood Facebook group from some resort in the Keys. I hired a professional installer who came out on Saturday morning and had the entire setup completed by early afternoon. The beam antenna was mounted on a push-up mast attached to the back of my roof, exactly as I had proposed. From the street, you couldn't see anything. From Mrs. Henderson's house behind me, you could see the antenna, but it wasn't any more intrusive than a satellite dish. For 3 glorious days, I enjoyed proper HF operation. I made contacts in California, worked a station in Japan, and even caught some European stations during a band opening. It was everything I had been missing. On Wednesday evening, I heard the knock on my door that I knew was coming. Francine stood on my front porch, her face red, a paper clutched in her hand. Behind her stood some guy in a polo shirt holding a clipboard, probably the community's property inspector or handyman. "Mr. Owens," she said, her voice shaking with anger, "you have violated the HOA covenants by installing an unauthorized structure without approval." "I did apply for approval," I said calmly. "You denied it without proper cause." "We had every cause," Francine shot back. "And now you've left us no choice. You have 48 hours to remove that monstrosity, or we'll have it removed for you and bill you for the costs. Additionally, you're being fined $500 for the violation, with an additional $250 per day until it's removed." "You can't do that," I said. "Federal regulations protect my right to have this antenna." "Try me," Francine said. She thrust the paper at me. It was an official violation notice, complete with citations to various sections of the HOA covenants. 48 hours, Mr. Owens. "And if you continue to fight us on this, we can and will place a lien on your property." She turned and walked away before I could respond, her accomplice following behind her. I spent that evening on the phone with an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He confirmed what I already suspected. Yes, I was legally in the right. Yes, PRB 1 should protect me. But actually enforcing those rights would require litigation that could drag on for months and cost me more than the antenna was worth. The HOA could continue fining me and eventually place a lien on my house, making it difficult to sell or refinance. I could fight back, but it would be expensive and time-consuming. "My advice," the attorney said, is to remove the antenna and file a formal complaint with the FCC. Sometimes the threat of federal involvement is enough to make HOAs reconsider. If that doesn't work, we can discuss litigation options. I didn't want to remove my antenna. I wanted to stand my ground on principle, but I also didn't want to risk losing my house or drowning in legal fees. The next day, I had the installer come back and take down the antenna. It killed me to watch it come down, especially knowing I was right and Francine was wrong. I filed my FCC complaint the following week, detailing everything that had happened. I included copies of my original application, the denial letter, the violation notice, and documentation of the fines. The FCC acknowledged my complaint but warned me that resolution could take several months. The months dragged on. Summer turned into early fall, and I continued operating with my inadequate indoor antenna. Francine, apparently satisfied with her victory, left me alone. We'd pass each other in the neighborhood occasionally, and she'd give me this smug little smile that made my blood boil. Then September arrived, and with it came hurricane season. I'd lived in Florida long enough to know that hurricane season was serious business, but I'd been lucky so far. In my 3 years in Coral Springs, we'd had some close calls, but nothing that resulted in major damage. Most hurricanes either turned north before hitting us or weakened before making landfall. Hurricane Ophelia was different from the start. It formed off the coast of Africa in early September, and meteorologists were tracking it carefully from day one. The storm strengthened rapidly as it crossed the Atlantic, reaching Category 5 status before anyone expected. The projected path had it heading straight for South Florida. I started preparing early, like most Floridians who take hurricanes seriously. I stocked up on water, non-perishable food, batteries, and fuel for my generator. I checked my emergency kit, made sure my important documents were in waterproof containers, and prepped my house as best I could. I also made sure all my ham radio equipment was ready to go. My mobile rig could run off my generator, and I had my handheld radios charged and ready. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with activity as the storm approached. People were asking for recommendations on shutters, sharing information about evacuation zones, and debating whether to stay or leave. Francine, in her capacity as HOA president, posted several messages reminding everyone to secure their outdoor furniture and follow the community's hurricane preparation guidelines. 4 days before the projected landfall, Ophelia was upgraded to Category 5 with sustained winds of 175 miles per hour. The National Hurricane Center's cone of uncertainty had tightened, and Coral Springs was right in the middle of it. Evacuation orders were issued for coastal areas, and inland residents were urged to shelter in place or head north if possible. I decided to stay. My house was solid concrete block construction. I was well inland, and I had everything I needed to ride out the storm. Plus, I wanted to be available on the local emergency radio nets if needed. Without my outdoor antenna, I was limited in what I could do, but I could still monitor VHF and UHF frequencies and possibly relay messages if necessary. The day before the hurricane hit, the neighborhood became a ghost town. I watched as at least half of my neighbors loaded up their cars and headed north. Others shuttered their windows and hunkered down. Francine, I noticed, was among those who left. I saw her Mercedes packed to the ceiling with luggage pulling out of her driveway around noon. I spent the afternoon making final preparations. I brought in everything from my yard, double-checked my supplies, filled my bathtubs with water, and set up my ham radio station in my interior hallway, the most protected part of my house. I put fresh batteries in my flashlights, tested my generator one more time, and cooked a large meal while I still had power. That evening, the sky took on an eerie yellow-green color. The wind started picking up and the rain began. At first, it was just a steady drizzle, but within a few hours, it had intensified to a heavy downpour. I listened to my battery-powered weather radio as the meteorologists provided updates. Ophelia had weakened slightly to a Category 4, but it was still a massive, dangerous storm. The power went out around midnight. One moment I was watching the local news on my laptop, and the next, everything went dark except for my emergency lights. The wind was howling now, a constant roar that made the whole house vibrate. Rain hammered against the windows and walls like someone firing a pressure washer at full blast. I settled into my hallway with my radio equipment and tried to get comfortable. It was going to be a long night. I monitored the local repeater frequencies, listening as emergency managers coordinated response efforts and amateur radio operators checked in to report conditions. A few people reported minor damage, mostly lost shingles and downed tree branches, but so far, nothing catastrophic. Around 3 in the morning, Ophelia made landfall near Fort Lauderdale, about 25 miles south of Coral Springs. The storm had weakened to a Category 3, which was good news, but it was still packing winds of 120 miles per hour. The eye wall passed just south of us, which meant we caught the northern edge of the worst conditions. The noise was incredible. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. I could hear things hitting my house, probably debris from other properties. Something large crashed against my roof with a bang that made me jump. Through the gaps in my hurricane shutters, I could see trees bending at impossible angles. Power lines sparked and snapped like fireworks. Then, around 4 in the morning, something strange happened. The wind suddenly dropped and the rain became almost gentle. For a moment I thought the storm had passed, but then I realized what was happening. We were in the eye. I cautiously opened my front door and stepped outside. The air was calm and humid, almost peaceful. The sky above showed stars through breaks in the clouds, but all around me I could see devastation. Trees were down everywhere. Shingles littered the streets. A car several houses down had been crushed by a large oak tree. Across the street, a fence had been completely flattened. I grabbed my handheld radio and started walking through the neighborhood, documenting the damage. Most of the houses looked intact structurally, but there were damaged roofs, broken windows, and debris everywhere. I keyed my radio and checked into the emergency net, reporting what I was seeing. "This is K4WON, mobile in the Sunset Meadows subdivision," I said. "We're in the eye right now. Widespread damage to trees and fences, several roofs compromised, but no obvious structural failures to homes. No injuries observed." The net control station acknowledged my report and logged the information. I was about to head back inside when I heard someone calling my name. "Walter, Walter, is that you?" I turned and saw my neighbor Jim Henderson, husband of the Mrs. Henderson who had supposedly complained about my antenna. He was standing in his driveway in a raincoat, looking shaken. "Jim, you should get back inside," I said. "The eye's going to pass and the backside of the storm is going to hit soon." I know, he said, walking toward me. "But Walter, we have a problem. My wife, Carol, she fell when the power went out. Hit her head pretty bad. She's conscious, but she's got a nasty gash and she's dizzy. I tried calling 911, but the phones aren't working. Cell towers must be down." My stomach dropped. "How bad is the bleeding?" "I got it stopped with some towels, but she really needs to see a doctor. I don't know what to do. I can't drive her in this." "No, definitely don't try to drive," I said. But I can help. I've got a radio. I can contact emergency services and let them know we need medical assistance. Jim's face flooded with relief. Really? You can do that? Yeah, come on. We need to hurry before the backside of the storm hits. We rushed back to my house, and I immediately got on my VHF radio, switching to the emergency services frequency. This is K4WON with a priority traffic. We have a civilian with a head injury at 2547 Sunset Drive in Coral Springs. Patient is conscious but possibly has a concussion. Bleeding is controlled. Requesting medical assistance when conditions allow. The emergency management coordinator responded immediately. K41, this is Emergency Operations Center. Copy your traffic. Be advised that no emergency vehicles can respond until the storm passes. Can you provide additional medical details? I handed the microphone to Jim and let him describe his wife's condition to the emergency coordinator. They determined that Carol was stable enough to wait, but would need evaluation as soon as possible. The coordinator logged the address and promised to send an ambulance as soon as it was safe. In the meantime, the coordinator said, K41, can you maintain communication? We're going to need all the operators we can get once this storm passes. Our regular communication systems are heavily damaged. Affirmative, I replied. I'm available for the duration. Jim thanked me profusely before heading back to his house. I barely had time to close my door before the wind picked up again. The backside of the hurricane hit with renewed fury, possibly even stronger than the first half. The wind came from the opposite direction now, and I heard more crashes and bangs as the storm wreaked further havoc. I stayed on the radio throughout the rest of the night, monitoring emergency traffic and relaying messages when needed. Without my outdoor antenna, my range was limited, but I could communicate locally, which was what mattered most right now. Dawn broke gray and miserable. The wind was still strong, but the worst had passed. Ophelia was now slowly grinding its way inland, weakening as it went but still dumping tremendous amounts of rain. I ventured outside again to assess the damage in daylight. The neighborhood looked like a war zone. Trees were down across streets, making them impassable. Power lines hung loose and dangerous. Roofs were missing shingles, some missing entire sections. Someone's trampoline had ended up wrapped around a telephone pole. Water was standing several inches deep in the streets, and it was still raining steadily. I walked through the neighborhood with my handheld radio, documenting everything. I knocked on doors to check on people. Most were okay, just shaken and dealing with various levels of property damage. A few elderly residents were frightened and needed reassurance. I gave them updates on what was happening and when they could expect help. Around mid-morning, I received a call on my radio from the Emergency Operations Center. K41, this is EOC. We need you to conduct a damage assessment for your area. Can you provide a detailed report on conditions in Sunset Meadows? I spent the next hour walking every street in the neighborhood that I could safely access, reporting back on conditions. Houses damaged, streets blocked, utility lines down, flooding depth, everything they needed to prioritize response efforts. It became clear that my radio was the only reliable communication link the neighborhood had. Cell towers were down, internet was out, landlines were dead. If anyone needed help, they had to come find me. Word spread quickly. By afternoon, I had a steady stream of neighbors coming to my door with various needs. Mrs. Patterson needed to let her daughter in Orlando know she was safe. The Johnsons needed to report a gas leak. The Rodriguez family had a tree through their roof and needed emergency tarping. Each time, I relayed their information to the appropriate authorities via radio. I also set up a charging station in my garage, running extension cords from my generator so people could charge their phones. Even though the cell towers were down, people wanted their phones charged and ready for when service was restored. I became the unofficial neighborhood communication hub. The rain continued through the second day, though the wind had died down to more reasonable levels. Ophelia had stalled over central Florida, which meant we were stuck with the outer bands continuing to dump rain on us. The flooding got worse. Streets that had been merely wet were now under a foot of water. Some of the lower-lying houses had water seeping into their garages. I was on the radio almost constantly now, coordinating with emergency services, relaying messages, and providing updates to my neighbors. I set up a dry erase board on my garage door where I posted the latest information about when power might be restored, where people could get supplies, and what roads were passable. On the third day after the hurricane hit, I received a radio call that would change everything. K41, this is EOC. We have a critical situation developing. We've received reports of multiple people trapped by rising water in a retirement community about 2 miles west of your location. Our dispatch systems are overloaded, and we're having trouble coordinating rescue efforts. We need you to establish a communication link with first responders in your area. Copy that. EOC. What do you need from me? We're going to route emergency traffic through you. You'll relay information between incident commanders and our operations center. We need you to maintain this link continuously until we can get our systems back online. For the next 8 hours, I was the critical communication node for rescue operations throughout northern Broward County. I relayed information about where boats were needed, where high-water vehicles could get through, which roads were impassable, and where people needed immediate assistance. My house became an actual emergency command post, with first responders stopping by to coordinate with me in person when radio communication was difficult. My neighbor Jim Henderson came by with sandwiches and coffee, a gesture of thanks for helping his wife. Carol had been evacuated by ambulance once conditions permitted and was recovering well, though she did have a concussion. Other neighbors brought food too, realizing I hadn't left my radio to eat in many hours. By the fourth day, Ophelia had finally moved on, and the skies began to clear. The flooding started to recede. Power crews and tree removal services flooded into the area and began the long process of restoring normalcy. But communication infrastructure was still heavily damaged. Cell service was spotty at best, and many areas still had no internet or phone service. I continued to operate as a communication link, now helping reunite families, coordinating delivery of supplies, and helping people contact insurance companies. I barely slept, catching quick naps between radio calls. On the 5th day, something amazing happened. A news crew from one of the Miami stations showed up at my door. Apparently, someone at the Emergency Operations Center had mentioned the ham radio operator who had been single-handedly maintaining communications for an entire neighborhood during and after the hurricane. The reporter, a woman named Lisa, wanted to interview me. I was hesitant at first, looking at my unshaven face and rumpled clothes, but she insisted the story was important. "Mr. Owens, can you tell us about what you've been doing since the hurricane hit?" she asked, her cameraman filming. I explained how I'd been using my amateur radio to coordinate with emergency services, relay messages for neighbors, and help organize rescue operations. I showed her my radio setup, the charging station in my garage, and the information board I'd been maintaining. "This is incredible," Lisa said. "How many people would you say you've helped?" "Directly. Probably everyone in this neighborhood, maybe 300 families. Indirectly, through the emergency coordination I've been doing, possibly thousands. And you've been doing this for almost 5 days straight. Someone had to, I said simply. When regular communications are down, amateur radio operators step up. That's what we do. I understand there's more to this story, Lisa said. Something about your homeowners association. I hadn't planned to bring up the HOA issue, but once she asked, I explained the whole situation. How I'd tried to install a proper antenna, how Francine had denied my application despite federal protections, how I'd been fined and threatened when I installed it anyway, and how I'd been forced to take it down. So you've been operating this whole time with limited equipment? Lisa asked, looking shocked. Yeah, just an indoor antenna and my VHF/UHF radios. If I'd had my HF beam antenna up, I could have had direct communication with the National Hurricane Center, other emergency operations centers around the state, and backup communication systems nationwide. Instead, I've been limited to line-of-sight communication and relying on repeaters that are running on backup power. Have you heard from your HOA president since the hurricane? No, she evacuated before the storm and hasn't come back yet, as far as I know. The interview aired that evening on the local news, and apparently it struck a nerve. Within hours, it had been picked up by other local stations, then by regional networks. By the next morning, it had gone viral online. My phone, once cell service was finally restored, wouldn't stop ringing. News organizations from around the country wanted interviews. Amateur radio clubs were reaching out in support. And most significantly, several lawyers specializing in HOA disputes contacted me offering their services pro bono. On the 7th day after the hurricane, Francine Anderson returned to Sunset Meadows. I was in my garage, still running the charging station and helping neighbors, when her Mercedes pulled up. She got out, looked around at the disaster area that our neighborhood had become, and immediately headed toward me. "Mr. Owens," she said, her voice tight, "I need to speak with you." "Hello, Francine. Welcome back. I hope you stayed safe during the evacuation." "I saw the news reports," she said, ignoring my pleasantries. "You had no right to discuss private HOA business with the media." I looked at her, genuinely amazed at her priorities. "Francine, I was asked about how I'd been helping during the hurricane." The antenna issue came up naturally in the conversation. "You're making the HOA look bad." I stated facts. "You denied my application for an antenna that I'm federally protected to have. You fined me and threatened to put a lien on my house. Those are facts." "This is going to cause serious problems," Francine said. "The board is already receiving emails and phone calls. People are threatening to sue us, to report us to the FCC, all kinds of things. Maybe you should have thought about that before you violated federal regulations," I said. "We didn't violate anything. We enforced our community covenants." "Francine, I've got about a dozen lawyers who would love to explain to you exactly how wrong you are about that. But right now, I've got actual important things to deal with. People still need help, so if you'll excuse me." I turned to walk away, but she grabbed my arm. "This isn't over, Mr. Owens." I pulled my arm free and looked at her seriously. "You're right, it's not, because I'm going to make sure that every amateur radio operator in Florida knows what you did. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the FCC, and I'm going to pursue every legal option available to me to make sure this never happens to another ham operator in this state. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do." I walked away, leaving her standing in my driveway. Several of my neighbors who had witnessed the exchange gave me supportive nods. Jim Henderson even started a slow clap that a few others joined over the next few weeks as the neighborhood slowly recovered, the pressure on the HOA board intensified. The story had captured national attention, particularly among the amateur radio community and among people who had their own HOA horror stories. The American Radio Relay League, the national organization for amateur radio operators, released a statement condemning the Sunset Meadows HOA and offering support for my case. The board called an emergency meeting, which I attended along with about 200 other residents. The community clubhouse was packed. Francine tried to maintain control of the meeting, but she was bombarded with questions and criticism from all sides. "Mr. Owens saved lives during the hurricane," one resident pointed out, "and you tried to stop him from having the equipment he needed." "The covenants are clear," Francine insisted. "We have to maintain standards." "Standards?" Another resident shouted. "Walter's been charging everyone's phones, coordinating emergency services, and helping people get medical attention, and you're worried about standards." A lawyer in the audience, one of the ones who had contacted me, stood up and addressed the board. "I want to make something very clear to this board. PRB 1 is federal law. Your covenants do not supersede federal law. You have exposed this HOA to significant legal liability. If Mr. Owens chooses to sue, which he absolutely should, you will lose. And when you lose, every homeowner in this community will be liable for the damages because HOA losses come out of the general fund." The room erupted in angry voices. Francine tried to restore order but failed. The meeting devolved into chaos, with multiple residents calling for the board's resignation. I let them argue for a while before I stood up and raised my hand. The room gradually quieted. "Look," I said, "I don't want to sue the HOA. That hurts everyone, not just the board. What I want is simple. I want permission to install my antenna according to the original plan I submitted. I want the fines reversed. And I want an acknowledgement from the board that amateur radio antennas will be reasonably accommodated in the future, as required by federal law." "That seems more than reasonable," someone called out. Francine looked like she'd swallowed something bitter, but she was cornered and she knew it. "I'll need to consult with the rest of the board." "No," I said firmly. "We're all here now. Let's settle this tonight." The board members huddled together, whispering urgently. Finally, Francine turned back to face the crowd. "Fine. Mr. Owens can install his antenna. The fines will be reversed, and we'll review our policies regarding amateur radio equipment." "Not good enough," the lawyer called out. "You need to formally acknowledge that you will accommodate amateur radio operators in accordance with PRB 1, and you need to put it in writing." After more discussion, the board agreed. They would draft a formal policy acknowledging FCC regulations and establish a process for amateur radio operators to apply for antenna installation with reasonable accommodations guaranteed. The policy would be added to the community covenants and conditions. The meeting finally ended around midnight. As people filed out, dozens of neighbors stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Jim Henderson pulled me aside and said, "Carol and I were talking. We want to thank you properly for everything you did. We'd like to take you to dinner once things settle down." "That's not necessary," I said. "Maybe not, but we want to do it anyway. You saved her life, Walter. If you hadn't been able to radio for help, I don't know what would have happened." Over the following weeks, things slowly returned to normal. Power was restored to the entire neighborhood. Streets were cleared. Damaged roofs were repaired. The scars from Hurricane Ophelia would take years to fully heal, but we were recovering. I hired the same installer who had put up my antenna the first time, and we got it reinstalled. This time, nobody complained. In fact, several neighbors came by to watch the installation and ask questions about amateur radio. Two of them expressed interest in getting their own licenses. The HOA formally adopted the new policy regarding amateur radio antennas. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge improvement. The policy acknowledged FCC regulations, established clear guidelines for antenna installation, and prohibited blanket denials based solely on aesthetics. Francine resigned from the HOA board 2 months after the hurricane. She claimed it was due to personal reasons, but everyone knew the real story. She'd become a pariah in the neighborhood after her behavior during the crisis. The new HOA president, a retired engineer named Bob, was much more reasonable and actually took an interest in amateur radio after seeing what I'd accomplished during the hurricane. The American Radio Relay League recognized me with their Public Service Award for my emergency communications work during Hurricane Ophelia. The ceremony was held at a ham fest in Orlando, and several of my neighbors made the drive to attend. It was humbling to be recognized, but more importantly, it highlighted the critical role that amateur radio operators play during emergencies. 6 months after the hurricane, I was contacted by the Broward County Emergency Management Office. They wanted to establish a formal relationship with local amateur radio operators to ensure better coordination during future disasters. I helped organize a local amateur radio emergency service group, and we began conducting regular drills and training exercises with county emergency management. The most satisfying moment came almost a year after the hurricane. I was contacted by a reporter doing a follow-up story on Hurricane Ophelia's impact on South Florida. She wanted to interview people who had been affected by the storm and how they had recovered. During the interview, she asked me if I had any regrets about how things had played out with the HOA. "No regrets," I said. "I wish Francine had been reasonable from the start, and I wish it hadn't taken a major hurricane to prove the importance of what I was trying to do. But ultimately, the system worked. Federal protections exist for a reason, and when they're violated, there are consequences. I hope other HOAs learn from what happened here." "You think they will?" she asked. "Some will, some won't. But at least in this neighborhood, amateur radio operators are protected now. And that's a win not just for me, but for everyone who lives here. Because next time there's a disaster, and there will be a next time, we'll be better prepared." The story aired during Hurricane Preparedness Week, as the new hurricane season was ramping up. It served as a reminder of what had happened the previous year, and how important it was to have multiple forms of communication during emergencies. As I write this, 2 years after Hurricane Ophelia, I'm sitting in my office with my HF radio on, monitoring a frequency where operators are checking into a weather net. There's a tropical disturbance forming off the African coast that meteorologists are watching carefully. It might become something, or it might fizzle out. Either way, I'm ready. My antenna is still up, performing beautifully. I've made hundreds of contacts around the world, including several during radio contests where I've placed well in my category. But more importantly, I'm ready to provide emergency communications if needed. The neighborhood has fully recovered from the hurricane. Trees have been replanted, damaged buildings repaired, and life has returned to normal. But there's a new appreciation for preparedness that wasn't there before. More residents have emergency kits, generators, and plans for what to do when the next big storm comes. 3 residents have gotten their amateur radio licenses since the hurricane, inspired by what they saw me do during and after Ophelia. I helped all of them study for their exams, and we've formed a small but active ham radio club in the neighborhood. We meet monthly to discuss radio topics, plan emergency preparedness initiatives, and just enjoy the hobby together. The HOA board is now actually supportive of amateur radio activities. Bob, the current president, even attended one of our club meetings to learn more about what we do. When one of the new hams wanted to put up an antenna, the approval process was smooth and straightforward, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Jim and Carol Henderson have become good friends. We have dinner together regularly, and Jim is actually studying for his technician license exam. Carol jokes that she wants to learn too, just so she can understand what her husband and I are always talking about. I still work as an IT systems administrator, but I've become much more involved in emergency preparedness initiatives. I give presentations at schools about amateur radio and emergency communications. I participate in emergency drills with local and county emergency management. And I'm an active member of several emergency response networks that provide communication support during disasters. Looking back on everything that happened, I'm struck by how a simple fight over an antenna turned into something much bigger. It highlighted the tension between individual rights and community rules, between federal authority and local governance, and ultimately between doing what's convenient and doing what's right. Francine thought she was protecting property values and maintaining community standards. What she was actually doing was putting people at risk. When Hurricane Ophelia hit, those property values and aesthetic standards didn't matter at all. What mattered was being able to communicate, to call for help, to coordinate rescue operations, and to keep people safe. I don't claim to be a hero. I was just a guy with a radio doing what needed to be done. But if my experience taught me anything, it's that we need to fight for the things that matter, even when it's difficult. Those federal protections for amateur radio operators exist because someone recognized that emergency communications could mean the difference between life and death. Francine learned that lesson the hard way, and I hope other HOA boards take note. The amateur radio community often talks about providing communications when all else fails. During Hurricane Ophelia, I lived that motto. When cell towers were down, internet was out, and phone lines were dead, my radio still worked. It connected people with help, reunited families, and saved lives. That's worth fighting for, even if it means going up against an unreasonable HOA president with a bad attitude and a misguided sense of authority. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is simple. Know your rights, stand your ground when you're legally protected, and never underestimate the importance of being prepared. Disasters don't care about homeowners association covenants or architectural review committees. When the storm hits, the only thing that matters is whether you're ready to help. I'm ready. My antenna is up, my equipment is maintained, my emergency supplies are stocked, and I'm monitoring the frequencies. Whatever comes next, whether it's another hurricane, a flood, a wildfire, or any other disaster, I'll be here, radio at the ready, prepared to serve my community. And if another HOA president tries to stop me or any other amateur radio operator from having the equipment we need to save lives, well, they'd better hope their property values keep them warm when the power goes out and they need help. Because federal law is on our side, and we're not backing down. The fight over my antenna taught Sunset Meadows an important lesson. Sometimes what looks like an eyesore is actually a lifeline. Sometimes what seems like an unnecessary hobby is actually a critical emergency resource. And sometimes the person you're fighting against is the same person who will save your life when everything else fails. Hurricane Ophelia changed our community forever, but not in the ways anyone expected. It didn't destroy us. It didn't divide us. It brought us together and showed us what really matters. And it proved beyond any doubt that when all else fails, amateur radio operators will be there. 73, as we say in the ham radio world, that's our shorthand for best regards. To everyone reading this, whether you're dealing with an unreasonable HOA, interested in amateur radio, or just trying to be better prepared for emergencies, 73. Stay safe, stay prepared, and remember that communication saves lives. My name is Walter Owens, call sign K4WON, and I'm standing by.